Hi friends, Father Carey here, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one asking the question, what does it mean to be in God? I meet every month with a lively group of very wise people, and we discuss theological and spiritual topics. We recently examined this particular question, which was raised by one of our group. We did not come to any final solution. I suspect that we could have talked about this for 3 lifetimes and still not come up with a definitive solution. But I think one way of boring into the question is by looking at what the 20th century Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner had to say about the divine horizon. The expression, we live and move and have our being in God, appears, of course, in the 17th chapter of Acts. In that particular chapter, St. Paul is in Athens. Athens, of course, was the seat of philosophical thinking in the ancient world. And he is speaking to philosophers on the Areopagus, which is a companion hillock to the Acropolis. And on the Areopagus, apparently, philosophers would congregate in order to discuss issues. Paul meets them there and he preaches to them about the unknown God whom he says we live and move and have our being in. Those of you who come from a Catholic tradition will recognize that in the final doxology of the Eucharistic prayer, when the priest elevates the consecrated host, the priest will say, through him, with him, and in him, in the unity of the Holy Spirit. In other words, the priest is repeating what Paul said to the philosophers so many centuries ago in Athens. I might add, and I think it's an important thing to notice, that the English translation of what Paul says in the Greek is rather anemic. At least I think it is. We translate it as have our being in. But the Greek is eimi, and eimi is a very active present tense verb. I think we would be much better off to translate what Paul says, although it sounds weird grammatically, is something like we live and move and is in God. We live and move and are in God. We live and move and we be in God. And what I mean to get across with that awkward grammarism is that the verb suggests that our being in God is very vital and energized and dynamic, whereas have our being in God can take on connotations of staticness and immobility, as if we are a can on a God shelf. Okay. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind, as one of us in my discussion group pointed out, is that to be in God ought not to be confused with the claim that we can be in the presence of God. To be in the presence of God surely, from a logical perspective, implies that God is here and we are here. To be in the presence of anything means that we are distant from, separated from, not identical to that which we are in the presence of. So we can stand in the presence of God. We can perhaps get closer to the presence of God. We can bask in the warmth of being in God's presence, but that's not at all the same as being in God. That's the first thing that we need to keep in mind to go forward. And the second thing we need to keep in mind is this. Whatever Paul means by saying we live and move and have our being in God, he is not advocating what's known as a pantheist position. Pantheism is the claim that everything that is identical to God. And the reason for that, as the Enlightenment philosopher Spinoza insisted, is that if God is infinite, and that's one of the characteristics that we just traditionally ascribe to God, then everything must be in God, because infinity contains everything that is. This is not a Christian position, if for no other reason than that Christians believe that God is personal, and a pantheistic God is impersonal. However, this is not to say that Spinoza is not worth reading. he is one of the wisest and loveliest philosophers in the Western tradition. And so I would really encourage you as a sidebar to pick up some Spinoza and to give him a go. He's difficult, but he is really rewarding. So, God, from the perspective of Paul's position, can't be just another object in the world that we stand in the presence of, nor can God be everything that is, because that kind of a God is radically impersonal. Along comes, 21 centuries after St. Paul, Karl Rahner. He is a Jesuit theologian, as I mentioned earlier, who wrestled with how it is that we can know about God. Rahner was very influenced by the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant was interested not just in what we know, but how we come to know what we know. And his final solution, to make a long story short, is that we humans are born with certain filters through which we read our experience. And these filters make sense of our experience. So, for instance, one of the filters is the filter of quantity. When we look at the world around us, when we experience the world around us, we experience quantity, right? There are this number of books in this room, there are this number of automobiles in the parking lot, and so on. Quantity isn't a objectively existing thing out there in the world. No, our experience reads into the world quantity. I know that may sound bizarre. All you need to take away from it is that Kant believed that in order to know anything, we must read experience through certain inborn filters or categories. Now, Rahner was very impressed by this, and he wondered if there might not be a way to extend Kant's notion of these inbuilt filters to account for our knowledge of God. And he came to the conclusion that there is. Rahner was very struck by the fact that consciousness is never satisfied, that our consciousness seems to be open. Consciousness never rests content with an idea or with an interpretation or with a desire. Consciousness always seems to think that there is more to be discovered. Consciousness always moves beyond the present in search of more. We see this in sciences, we see it in the humanities, we see it in our everyday lives, don't we? Consciousness seems to be radically open. And open to what? Well, there appears to be no limit to what consciousness is open to, and that makes Rahner suspect that maybe what consciousness is directing itself towards and yearns for without ever being able to reach, because consciousness in each individual, of course, is finite and limited, is infinity itself. Since we don't perceive infinity in our everyday experience, our everyday experience is about finite objects, that must mean, Rahner wants to argue, that we have a filter which somehow gives us the idea of infinity. He calls this a pre-apprehension of infinity. The German for pre-apprehension is Vorgriff, and Vorgriff is a kind of before-the-fact grabbing. So before we encounter anything in the world, we have a pre-apprehension of infinity, and we read all of our experience through that filter, whether we're aware of it or not. This pre-apprehension, this Vorgriff of infinity, helps us to understand the world around us. Or perhaps a better way of putting it is this: conditions the way in which we experience the world around us. And in order to get that point across, Rahner talks about a divine horizon. What is a horizon? Well, think of a landscape. A horizon is that part of the landscape which makes sense of everything within the landscape, right? Without a horizon, the landscape would just stretch on and on and on, and we would begin to lose our bearings. We would become disoriented. But the horizon serves as, if you will, the focus point or the meaning of what it is that we see. Without the horizon, we wouldn't have a focus point in a landscape. Well, our pre-apprehension of infinity, this God filter, if you will, that's not a phrase that Rahner uses, by the way, I'm using it. This filter through which we read reality suggests to us that there is another kind of horizon, a horizon of what you might call a Godscape. And that horizon, which is seen by us because of our ability to pre-apprehend infinity, makes real deep sense of everything that we encounter in experience. It explains to us why our consciousness is radically open. It explains to us that there is depth in what we encounter in the landscape that goes beyond the landscape. It helps us to recognize, my friends, that the world in which we live is not just saturated by God, but is in a Godscape. And that the horizon of God, the horizon of infinity, even though we can never reach it, no more than we can reach the horizon of a landscape, right? We climb over the hill and the landscape recedes in front of us. That notwithstanding the fact that the horizon of the Godscape is always out of reach, it nonetheless sheds light upon the Godscape, revealing its depth to us. So, you and I are members of this Godscape. Everywhere we are in a Godscape. And we can recognize that because of our pre-apprehension of infinity. And that may be what it means to be in God. That may be what it means to live and to move and to have our being in God. We live and we move and we are, we be in Godscape. And we can never not is or are or be in Godscape. And that Godscape is bounded by the divine horizon. There's a wonderful little book that came out in the mid-1980s by a Georgetown University theologian named John Hott. The book is entitled, What is God? And what Hott does is to try and simplify Rahner's theology in a very user-friendly way by looking at 5 very common human experiences which suggest this pre-apprehension of the infinite and this divine horizon. Those 5 experiences are of freedom and depth and beauty and the future and truth. And I would really recommend this book to you if you want to dive a little bit more deeply into what Rahner has to say about Godscape. So, my friends, let you and I continue to be more and more sensitive to the fact that we really are in God. I'm Father Carey, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thanks so much for watching. If you have a mind, I invite you to subscribe. But at any rate, I'll see you again soon. God bless. Bye-bye.